All right, guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this, a Smith and Wesson Model 36-1 chambered in 38 Special. Now, in order to talk about this, we are going to talk about a little bit of background, but not necessarily the full-on history of the Smith and Wesson Model 36. That will be reserved for a video at some point in the future. Other than to say that the Smith and Wesson Model 36 was introduced in 1950. In 1967, we got the -1. Now, for those of you who don't know, Smith & Wesson dash indicators on revolvers show that there was some sort of change, be it a production simplicity or some sort of features update on that particular revolver line. In this case, the Smith & Wesson no dash and the -1 were built both in a 1 7/8 inch barrel as well as a 3-inch barrel. However, on the no dash, the 3-inch barrel had a much lighter profile. It'd be something more akin to the pencil type profile barrel on a Smith & Wesson Model 10. On the -1, Smith & Wesson went to a heavier profile barrel on the 3-inch version, which we can see here. These guns would be produced from 1967 to 1988, in which there would be another change made, and now these are still a part of the Smith & Wesson Classics line, which I very seldom see in stores. For the most part, maybe that's like a special order, or they just have very low production on that revolver series. I figure the latter is probably the more likely outcome. All right, guys, that pretty much covers background. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the features of this particular handgun? As we already mentioned, we have a 3-inch barrel. Now, what are the advantages of the heavier weight profile of this 3-inch barrel? If we were talking about rifles, we would commonly say that like, oh, well, the thicker barrel is going to take more time to heat up, which is going to cause less movement of our groups and all that kind of stuff. That's not as big of a determining factor with handguns. But the other advantage that we see in both rifles and handguns is that a heavier barrel settles the gun down more. So in this case, this should flatten out the flip of the recoil of this particular handgun, allowing you to be able to recover your sights faster and get faster follow-up shots and all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting dynamics of this handgun. You see here we have a ramp type front sight. It is serrated in order to break down or in order to beat out glare, which I've never really noticed to be an issue on pistol sights, but I guess it won't be for sure in this case. The top of the barrel and the receiver are a darker matte finish as opposed to the rest of the bluing on this handgun, which is also supposed to help produce glare. You'll see that our ejector rod is captured and kind of shrouded a little bit there. This is actually part of the lockup of the revolver, which is obviously in swing out cylinders. Locking that cylinder in place is very important. But also being shrouded in the way that it is, this protects the ejector rod, which I've always kind of liked that about Smith & Wessons. I've seen a couple of Colts over the years that had bent ejector rods, and Colt on their earlier production revolvers did not necessarily shroud the ejector rod any. Coming back to our rear sight, it is a gutter type rear sight. These are very low profile combat sights with no real contrast between them. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting portion of this video. This is a 5-shot cylinder, typical of Smith & Wesson J-frame revolvers, which even though these dimensions are slightly stretched out in a couple of different directions, this is still fundamentally a J-frame revolver. This is not a plus P rated gun. It's an important thing to keep in mind. You are stuck to standard pressure 38 Special, which can be a touch anemic, but you can find good performing rounds in that chambering. Now let's go ahead and talk about our trigger real quick. So this is a double action, single action gun. Our double action trigger is not light by any means, but it is very smooth. There is a slight hitch, kind of a wall right at the end of its travel, which if you're trying to make a longer double action shot, I can see that being helpful. However, generally, I have just learned to kind of master the stroke of this double action revolver, which allows me to not have a lot of disturbance in my sight picture as I go through the cycle. And a lot of that also has to do with the release of the trigger, which for those of you who shoot a lot of like precision rifle and stuff like that, you're used to the concept of the follow through as well. It's still just as important on revolvers. Now, the single action trigger. The wall on the single action trigger is pretty stiff, But the brake is pretty precise and all that kind of stuff. There's not a lot of like additional travel once you get over the resistance of that wall. I really don't shoot the single action trigger that much on this handgun though, because I mostly do defensive style shooting with it, not a whole lot of like bullseye shooting at any distance. All right, our hammer is checkered, very deep checkering. It's very easy to be able to get a hold of. You will note that we have a firing pin mounted to the hammer. However, it's important to note that this is a transfer bar safety equipped gun. So as we can see here, if you look through that gap in the cylinder right there back towards the back plate, our firing pin is not currently poking into the chamber. That is because the trigger has not been pulled all the way to the rear. So this is a drop safe gun. There are some people out there who still believe, because they learned all their revolver safety stuff from Westerns, that you cannot carry a revolver with a live round underneath the hammer. That is not always the case with modern revolvers. If we're talking about modern combat revolvers or more defensive minded revolvers, you absolutely can. If you're talking about like single action army clones, that's something you have to keep a closer eye on. So there are people who still believe otherwise. My father is one of them. So if he carries a Smith and Wesson Model 36, he carries 4 rounds, which just seems silly because already revolvers are rounds limited. Why would you diminish it any further? Now, the cylinder release on Smith & Wessons, of course, are pushed forward. On Colts, it's pulled back. On Rugers, it's pushed down. The no dashes would have a flatter latch shape to it. I haven't found any issue with being able to activate the latch on either style of revolver, but, you know, 6 one, half a dozen of another, I guess. Now, it's also important to note that Smith & Wesson revolvers rotate counterclockwise. Colt revolvers rotate clockwise. This also plays into kind of like the different requirements for lockup on these revolvers. Let's talk about our grip real quick. We will note that this is a much longer grip than what you will commonly find on a Smith & Wesson J-frame, be it a Model 37, 638, 642, or the 1 7/8 inch barreled Smith & Wesson Model 36. It is not necessarily the same size as what you would find on like a Smith & Wesson Model 19 or 686, any of the duty size revolvers, but it is drastically larger than most snub-nose revolvers. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting dynamics of this particular handgun. You'll also note that we have the standard checkered wooden grips that Smith & Wesson used to put on their revolvers. There's Smith & Wesson emblems placed into the grip. And you'll also note that there's a little bit of a disparity in color of my grips. This entirely has to do with the amount that has been carried, so you can tell which side's been rubbing against my body. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? This revolver is an absolute blast to shoot, but let's go ahead and break it down by the numbers. First off, the sights. Yes, the sights do not necessarily stand out, and that can be a little bit troublesome. What I have found with presentation is that I kind of tip the muzzle up a little bit, grab my front sight, and then drop it into the gutter, which allows me to be able to pretty quickly acquire that front sight. I don't find myself fishing for that front sight too much. Which allows me to be, front sight focused and all that kind of stuff while I'm shooting anyway. In addition to that, let's talk about the barrel. So the 3-inch barrel most definitely does help kind of settle down recoil just a little bit, which allows me for those faster follow-up shots and being able to get back on my sights a little bit faster. I do appreciate that. It's part of why I enjoy shooting this revolver. The trigger, though heavy, being smooth and all that kind of stuff, I don't have a lot of disturbance to my sights. All of these are things that are helping me be able to have faster shot engagements with this particular handgun. Where things start to come apart a little bit comes down to this grip. Now, of course, as was mentioned before, I have more grip than your standard J-framed revolver, but I have less grip than a full-size combat revolver. So this grip still does have a tendency to move around a little bit in my hand whenever it is that I'm shooting it, like I would expect out of a J-framed revolver. So sometimes my groups open up a little bit. Now that doesn't mean that I go from hitting A zone to hitting into, you know, the outer ring or anything along those lines. It just means that I might have a whole bunch of rounds stacked really tight in A zone and then have something kind of wander a little bit as I get through multiple shots in that cylinder. Overall, it's not necessarily been too detrimental to accuracy as much as it will kind of cost me hundredths of a second of time of reacquiring my sight as the gun starts to move around my grip a little bit. That's just something you have to accept with J-frame revolvers. It's very difficult to shoot J-frame revolvers and compare them to a Glock 19 or any modern semi-automatic handgun. That's just the reality of the matter. Now, I have not necessarily taken this gun to courses or competitions or anything along those lines, but I have shot this in a local police qualification, and I actually passed. So I don't know if that necessarily means that I can shoot this revolver really well, or if police handgun qualifications are just not that hard. You can kind of draw from that whatever conclusion it is that you would like to. Now, when it comes to reliability and all that kind of stuff, a lot of people have a tendency to attribute this outrageous claim of reliability whenever it comes to revolvers, that revolvers never fail. And that's not necessarily always the case. Whenever you have any mechanical system, it has the possibility of atrophy, breakdown, and malfunction. However, revolvers are less likely to malfunction. The only real malfunction I've ever had out of this revolver is if I have not properly gotten that cylinder to lock up coming off of a reload or something along those lines. That's just something you have to watch out for whenever it is that you complete your reload, that you make sure that that cylinder locks all the way in. Otherwise, you're going to get a click, no boom on your first pull. Now, of course, the great thing about a revolver or any semi-automatic handgun is that you can just pull the trigger again and get right back to what it is that you need to be doing. So not necessarily the worst outcome in the world, just something to keep in mind whenever it comes to the manual of arms of a revolver. Now, when it comes to reloads on this particular handgun, with this gun being a little bit more stretched out and stuff as it is actually really easy to be able to fit a speed loader into the cylinder. I still prefer speed strips whenever I'm carrying J-frame revolvers just because they fit into my pockets better, but it is nice that as opposed to some of my other J-frame revolvers that are a little bit more scrunched up in the space because they have these shorter, fatter grips on them, it's nice to know that it's easy to be able to fit a speed loader in here and get it back out with relative ease. So that to keep in mind whenever it is that you're appraising different J-framed revolvers. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the shooting portion of this particular video. Why don't we go ahead and start to get into my recommendations? Would I recommend this revolver for duty use? If it was the 1970s, then absolutely. However, it is not. So this is not the handgun that I would necessarily recommend for the current working professional. You know, at one time, this would have been a great option for like a detective or a plainclothes police officer, but here today, things like the Glock 26, Glock 19, whatever flavor of striker-fired semi-automatic handgun you want to pick are better options for that type of application. What about self-defense, home defense? Well, I would still argue that for the vast majority of your common self-defense situations, a J-frame revolver, a 5-shot revolver in general, even a 6-shot revolver, will be effective to be able to get you through to the other side of that situation. Now, I would say that this is getting into minimal or suboptimal requirements, and something like a Glock 19, a CZ-P10C, a whatever type of semi-automatic handgun would have you be prepared for all situations. However, this should get you through most things. Facing 2 assailants, up to 3 maybe, depending on how good it is you are with the handgun. Now, of course, all this stuff comes down to training, which is something that you never really get away from. But with revolvers having a slightly more complicated manual of arms and all that kind of stuff, you definitely cannot overlook the training requirement with this handgun. You're already working with something that's kind of like minimal. Why would you want to stack the deck against you by not necessarily putting in a lot of training time with this particular revolver? Which is problematic when you talk about the 38 special chambering, because that ammunition is kind of expensive. It hasn't ever really come down in the past couple of years. It was never necessarily inexpensive, but time has definitely not made it any less so. Or any more so. 38 is expensive. Anyway, so what about for home defense? There's some utility in utilizing a revolver for home defense. The fact that you don't have magazine springs or anything to contend with, which pretty much means that this gun's always ready to go, and you don't have to worry about springs getting a memory or something like that and causing a malfunction in your handgun. However, this gun's also not necessarily readily accessible for lights. Is that a big deal? It kind of depends on your home defense strategy and how it is that you're going to have to clear the house. There's something to be said for not necessarily pointing a light-equipped handgun at, your kid or something like that in order to be able to figure out what went bump in the night. But also, you can utilize handheld flashlight techniques with a handgun. They are of questionable viability in today's systems. This is not a discussion about lights in the application of lights, other than to say that having a light-equipped gun gives you options as opposed to not having a light-equipped gun. So there's something to keep in mind whenever it is that you're talking about home defense systems and anything along those lines. In addition to that, if I'm talking about a home defense system, I'd like to preference a larger handgun so that I can have more controllability, I can have higher capacity and all that kind of stuff, because my bedside or my safe or whatever it is that I have the gun in or on is the thing that's supporting the weight, not necessarily my body. So this is something that might make me preference this for concealed carry, and something larger like a 686 or a Glock 17 or something along those lines for a bedside gun. This could do it, I just don't necessarily think it's the best application. What about competition use? Well, you could shoot this in competition. There are multiple disciplines that have divisions that are built around snub nose or revolvers in general, but like IDPA has their backup gun revolver class and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if anyone's necessarily like trying to be grandmasters or whatever, the experts in those fields necessarily are designated within those disciplines, but it is prudent to occasionally challenge yourself with your backup gun just to kind of see where you drop off with it. Because already we can expect that a backup gun is not necessarily going to perform as well as a full-sized version of itself. But it's still good to be able to know, to push your limits and know what you can and can't do with that particular handgun. As a woods gun or something along those lines, I would not necessarily recommend this. I think there's a lot of better options. If you're checking traps or something like that, a 22 LR or 22 mag would be a better choice. And if you're just bebopping around in the woods, I think a larger, more potent handgun would be acceptable. This would still handle your varmints of the two-legged variety, but maybe, depending on where you live, not necessarily animals of a more aggressive nature. All right, guys. Those are my recommendations. What are my uses with this particular handgun? This has been a consistent carry option for me over the years. I have carried this handgun a lot. I have trained with this handgun a lot for that purpose. I am very confident with this handgun and more than willing to take it into any normal self-defense situation. However, I would not preference this handgun if I knew that I was walking into a fight. I would prefer to carry something with a little bit more capacity. Capacity being the main thing that I'm worried about there. Also, perhaps a little bit larger depending on the situation of the fight and the circumstances therein. This handgun has performed exceedingly well for everything it is that I've asked it to do. I'm a huge fan of this as a carry option. And that's because I train with it a lot. And really, I'm the only person my age I know who trains with revolvers as much as I do, who even owns as many revolvers as much as I do. But I enjoy the challenge of being able to work around these handguns, and I enjoy being able to shoot them well, be able to do things well with them, which, there's a lot of things that kind of get into that discussion whenever it is that you're talking about revolvers versus semi-autos, and I've actually done a video on that. The link will be in the description. All right, what are my conclusions when it comes to this gun? What I find really interesting about this gun is this is kind of the Glock 19 of its time. And this is primarily putting it into semi-automatic handgun type discussions, but I think it is important to kind of ground this conversation in, a modern equivalent. 3-inch barrel, longer grip, and all that kind of stuff. It's like it's a beefed up version of the Glock 36, which is no different than a Glock 19 is a larger Glock 26 and a smaller Glock 17. So I could see this being somebody's kind of go-to one-size-fits-all solution between 1967 and 1988. Capacity is not necessarily bigger, but the dimensions of the firearm are bigger, and this does behave kind of like a larger revolver. It behaves more like a larger revolver than it does like a smaller when it comes to the shooting dynamics, and more like a smaller revolver than a larger revolver when it comes to the carry dynamics. Which is one of the reasons that I've never necessarily swapped out these grips for anything larger, because I don't want to compromise the size association I have with this gun. I like the relatively long but still short barrel and the relatively long but still short grip that make it ideal and a go-to option for me for concealed carry up until here recently, where I've been preferencing my Glock 26. The reasons for that are in my EDC video, which I'll put the link in the description as well. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.